Hey there, welcome to day 16. In this one, we're going to be doing a little bit more advanced usage of web browsing technologies. Now, what we did in earlier days was web scraping. That's a type of web browsing. But what we want to do now is actually be able to log in to an actual service and do the things that aren't natively supported by a REST API. In other words, we want to replace the keyboard and mouse with Python. So we're going to be using Selenium with Python. But before I even talk about it, let's take a look at an example. So first of all, we run our module called insta.py. That, of course, opens up a web browser, takes me to Instagram.com. That web browser is Chrome, and all of this is driven through Python and Selenium. So it's going to actually log me into this service. And look at, I don't have my hands on there. It did it. It typed it. It submitted the button. All of those things. Then it moves me over to a user, in this case, The Rock, and then their actual profile or one of their posts there. And it's actually going to go ahead and download some items onto my local system that's related to this post. And of course, something else that we cover is not just the item downloading, although that's really cool. I don't actually need to be logged in to download those things. But another thing that we cover is automated liking of the post and automated commenting, which is really the reason that part of the reason that we're here. But if we see this, I got all these images. They were all just downloaded, as well as the videos themselves, as you can see right there. Now we need to get Selenium installed. So if you're on a Windows, jump to this timestamp right here. It takes about 5 minutes to get your Windows set up. It's not really that complicated to do, but once you finish that, you'll come back and join the rest of us. If you're on a Linux, go to this link right here and follow their installation guides for the Linux distribution that you have. And if you're on Mac, we're going to go ahead and install it right now. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is actually go to my terminal and just install it globally. Now, the reason I'm installing it globally is to just make sure that I actually have Selenium working and working correctly. So I'm going to go in and jump in to Python 3-m pip install Selenium. No big deal there. Of course, I will use this in a virtual environment soon, but I wanted to install it globally just to verify that it's actually working. So jumping into Python 3, and of course I'm using Python 3.2.8, but this same setup process works for, I think, every version of Python 3, and then most likely will work in Python 4 as well. So inside of Python 3, I'm going to go ahead and import, I'll go do from Selenium, import WebDriver. So the WebDriver module class has a bunch of different types of drivers. So if we do WebDriver.chrome, this is the one we'll end up using, but there's one for Firefox. I think there's one for Safari. Just check the Selenium docs for more if you want that. And then we're going to go ahead and hit enter. Now, there's a chance that yours will jump open like this. It'll actually open a new web browser for you. But more than likely, you're not going to have what's called the Chrome driver installed. You'll see something like this. So this error here is to be expected. I didn't actually install a Chrome driver. All I have on my system right now is Chrome for me to use it, but not the individual Chrome driver for me to do programming with. So let's go ahead and install that now. Let's exit out of the Python shell, clear this out, and I want to install it using Homebrew. So brew.sh is where you're going to install it, and you're going to go ahead and just copy this link right here. Now, I already have it installed, and you might as well. So if you do, just go ahead and run brew update just to make sure that your system is up to date. Now we're going to go ahead and do a couple things related to Chrome driver. You might be tempted to run brew install Chrome driver, but unfortunately, that's not how we install it from this version of Homebrew or specifically for Chrome driver. So I have to do brew tap homebrew cask, and then once I let that finish, I have to run brew cask install Chrome driver. And you're going to use brew cask uninstall to uninstall Chrome driver as well. We hit enter. Now this is going to be a system-wide installation. So once you have it installed, you don't have to reinstall this. Unlike, let's say, for instance, Selenium, where you might have it in different virtual environments, Chrome driver is just something that Selenium uses. It's not something that they like sort of work hand in hand together with. So we can clear that out. And now what I'm going to do is try it out. So we'll go ahead and into Python 3. I'll do from Selenium. I'm going to import the web driver and then webdriver.chrome. Hit enter. And what this does is actually open up a web browser for me. Well, that's pretty cool. So I can also do something like this where I say browser equals to that web browser. And it opens up another instance of that web browser. Right? So notice that there's two now. So I can close out the one that I started with. And now I can go ahead and do browser.get https://cfe.sh. And before I hit enter, I'm just going to move over a little bit so I can see the web browser. And I hit enter. And what do you know? It actually changed that web browser for me. And it's also telling me that Chrome is being controlled by automated test software. So that's pretty cool. So that's actually how I can go ahead and open up a web browser and run with it. Now, for a little while, we'll actually have the web browser open. But what we can do is run with something called headless web browser, where it doesn't actually open up a web browser at all. It just runs as if it's going to open up a web browser, but we just don't see the browser itself, which is what you'll end up doing with automated tasks. If you just did the Mac installation and you want to skip Windows, just go to this timestamp right here. So let's go ahead and jump into PowerShell. First and foremost, I have Python 3.8.2 installed. So older versions of Python have actually worked with this method, and I would imagine newer versions will as well. Let's go ahead and install Selenium. So python-module pip install Selenium. And while that's running, I just want to point out I'm actually using the Chrome web browser here, and that's what I'm going to be using with Selenium. There are other web browsers that it supports, so definitely check the docs if you're interested in the other ones like Firefox or Edge. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into Python shell, and then I'm going to go ahead and import the WebDriver module. So from Selenium, import WebDriver. And if I just do webdriver.chrome and hit enter, I get this error, right? The Chrome driver executable needs to be in this path. So you can actually copy the link that comes here. It's actually really handy. All you need to do is select it and then right click on it. And then you can go to the Chrome WebDriver here and then go to all versions available and downloads. And then you're going to want to get the version of Chrome that you have, right? So like I just updated to version 81. So if you're not familiar with what that is, you can just click on the right-hand side with these three little dots, go to Help, and then click the About. I know it went off the screen there for a moment, but there's my version of Chrome right there. If you don't have the correct version of Chrome installed, you're going to see this error when you try to go ahead and use Chromium. So let's go ahead and download this. Chromium is just the driver that's going to allow us to use Chrome with Selenium. So I'm going to go ahead and download this driver here. It's Windows. Whatever version of Windows is available, that's the one I'm going to use. So in this case, it's just the 32-bit one. That's okay. I've tested it. It works. So with this one, we're going to go ahead and show this in our folder. And I'm going to unzip this by using 7-zip. And I'm going to use the command for extract files. I actually had to use this command and change the location of it specifically for permissions related things. So I'm going to go ahead and just change the location to my C drive into the local disk. So in here, and I'm going to put it into Chrome driver, and I'll say OK. And let's just verify that that's there by going into the C drive. And there's Chrome driver, and there it is. That's the actual application that will run. So now I need to add this into my path and my environment variables. So go ahead and hit the start menu there and go into and edit the system environment variables. Of course, if you hit the start menu and start typing, it will do a system search for you. Hopefully you know that. We're going to go ahead and click on environment variables here, and this is what should come up. I'm going to use this in my system variables. So I'm going to go ahead and find my path system variable. I'll go ahead and hit edit, and I'm going to create a new one. In this case, it's just adding in Chrome driver, right? So the same name that I used here is gonna be the name that I'm gonna want to use inside of my environment variables there. And I'm gonna go ahead and move this all the way up to the top. Probably not 100% necessary to do that, but I like whenever I add a new driver in there, I just put it at the very top. Okay, so we save that, say okay to everything. I'm going to actually close out of PowerShell just to refresh my session. And then I'm going to jump into Python again. We'll go ahead and do from Selenium import WebDriver dot Chrome. So the Chrome class, we hit enter. And a web browser actually pops open for me. Notice it's not actually anywhere, but this is actually giving me a real web browser that I can actually work with. We can just test and verify real quick here. I'm going to go ahead and run that again, but this time I'm going to go ahead and call it browser equals to, and then I'm going to set it equal to Chrome's WebDriver.Chrome, and then that's going to open up a new browser. And then like magic, I'm just going to go ahead and type out browser.get, and we'll do http cfe.sh, hit enter, and what do you know? So that's pretty cool. We now have a way to browse the internet using Python code. There's a lot more we need to do for this, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's go ahead and open up VS Code, make a day 16 directory if you haven't already. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and make our first file. I'm going to call this google.py, as in we're going to be doing a Google search to start out. And then I'm also going to create a virtual environment. So let's go ahead and initialize a virtual environment. Open up terminal, and we're going to go ahead and cd into day 16. And of course, we'll do pip env install Selenium. And I'm going to be using Python 3.8. Okay, so while that's running, I'm going to go into my google.py file, and we'll just go ahead and say from Selenium, we're going to import the web driver. Okay, so with our virtual environment done, I'll go ahead and activate pip env shell, make sure I'm in there. Let's go ahead and close down that Explorer. So inside of google.py, I'm going to go ahead and declare my web browser. So of course it's webdriver.chrome, or like .firefox if you were using that one. So this, I want to actually navigate to a URL. So the first URL I'm going to use is, let's go ahead and jump into google.com. It's really simple. It's just browser.get that URL. So if I run this, it's going to open up the Chrome driver version of Chrome and navigate to this URL. Let's go ahead and try that out. So python-i google.py, I hit enter, and what do you know? It navigates there. Now the reason I actually use the interactive shell has to do with the fact that now I can actually use the browser itself. So I can say browser.get https duckduckgo.com, hit enter, and it actually navigates to DuckDuckGo. Right? It's going to navigate wherever I want it to. Really cool. Okay, so the goal here is actually really simple. We just want to run a Google search. That's all we're going to be doing with this portion. Now, the reason for that is because that's the fundamental underlying thing of everything we can do with Selenium beyond just the web scraping portion. So, of course, it can get complicated because of how these websites are designed. But before we get to the complicated stuff, let's start with the easy stuff. Now, the first thing that I need to do is actually enter my search query, whatever that's going to be, right? So to enter a search query, we have to look for an input with the type of text. So this actually renders out that text box. So once that text box is there on an HTML page, that's the element that it is. This is the HTML element itself. You might be familiar with this. Hopefully you are at least a little bit. But what this does is it renders out this. Now, each HTML element, every single one, whether it's an input type of text or a text area, most of the time, these things have what's called attributes. So attributes can be stuff like a class or a CSS class, an ID, or a name. So in our case, I actually want to find out what this name is. Typically, when you see these kinds of inputs, whether they're just a raw input or a text area, you will actually see a name that's associated to it. That name makes it really easy to identify that's the element that we want. The reason it's easy to identify has to do with, number one, how Selenium works. Number two, those names are going to be a lot more reliable than their class names or even their IDs, right? Because it's really easy to change a class name. The actual HTML element name is not as easy because that often relies on the backend. So the backend actually has to do something with whatever this name value is, where the class and the ID are often more corresponding to how it looks versus to how it functions. Name is often how it functions. So that's a cool little thing to know if you're not familiar with it. So what we need to do is actually find out what the name is of this Google HTML element. Now, the easiest way to do this is to actually open up Chrome, whether it's from Selenium or just a regular Chrome web browser. Right-click or control-click and inspect the element you want to see. Now, every once in a while, I'm going to zoom in on the elements console here. Every once in a while, when you do that inspect element, it doesn't bring you to the correct one. So you might have to do it a couple times just to make sure you're at the actual right element. And it's also easy to denote because when I scroll over these different elements, it actually highlights what I'm looking for. But yet again, I'm looking for the input class itself or the input element itself. And this is it right here. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this as HTML with control-click. And I'll just copy this entire thing. And I'm going to put it under my notes here. Okay. So as we see here, we've got the input class. This was what I discussed before up here. We've got an attribute of max length. And hey, look at that. The third one is the name of Q. So we can be pretty confident that all we really need for this element is this. So I'm actually going to run with that. I'm going to assume that that is the correct thing. Now, once you see something that you know and you're familiar with, that's when you test it. You don't try and look for the best possible option right off the bat. Instead, you should test as soon as you can so you can get things going as fast as you can. So now the question is, I have my input element. Let's go ahead and call this the search L. How do I actually grab that, right? So I know that I want the name equaling to Q. How do I actually grab this search element? Well, the documentation for Selenium definitely shows you how to do this. So in the WebDriver API, we can scroll down and look for remote WebDriver. And then if you scroll down from there, you'll see a bunch of different methods you can run on our WebDriver element or the instance of the WebDriver, which the instance of the WebDriver is browser in this case. So what I'm showing you is methods you can run on that browser class. Now we can also write out dir browser, and that will also show me all of those same things, right? So that's pretty cool. So what we actually want to do is use something called find element by name. This is in both places, of course. This is in the documentation. It shows you a number of things, but we've got find element by name. And again, the reason I know that that's what I want is because we want one of the elements that has the name of Q. So I'm going to go ahead and just say browser.find element by name, and we can use Q. Now, if you're actually familiar with CSS, you can do another one that's find element by CSS selector. And you can use a CSS selector, say for instance like H1. That would be whatever the H1 element, or multiple elements by just typing an S there. Either way, both of those things will work, and it's pretty cool. If it doesn't find it, it will run an exception, which we'll see a little bit later once we get this down. Okay, so now that I've got this, let's go ahead and exit out of my interactive window here, or the interactive Python shell, and I'm going to go ahead and print out what this search element is. Let's run the interactive shell again, and this time it's going to open a brand new window for me. I do still have this other one open, so I'm going to close that one out. I don't need it any longer. But now it actually shows me this element here, right? So if that element was not found, it would run an exception saying that this element is not found. Kind of makes sense. Okay, so what is it that I'm trying to do here? I'm trying to send text to this element. Now you do this by using something called send keys. So if you do searchL.send keys, and then whatever text that we want to use. So I'll go ahead and say Selenium Python. Okay, so this is what I'm going to send. I'll just do it on my interactive shell for right now and hit enter. Let's look at the browser that I've got open. Whoa, it's already there. Okay, so I'm going to just put this towards the bottom, and I'm going to bring up my interactive shell a little bit so we can see the search box as well as interactive shell. If I try that again, what do you know? It's going to keep putting it in there. That's pretty cool, right? But I actually don't want that. I just want the one-time search. So I'll go ahead and close that out. And I'll leave in the Selenium Python. Okay. So now what we need to do is actually find the way to actually submit this form. Okay. So submitting forms is going to be one of two types of elements. The first one will be input type of submit. Everything else doesn't really matter. Every other attribute doesn't really matter. Another one you might see is button type of submit. So those are a couple. You can also look for potentially a form element. I'm not going to go in this one right here, but you can also look for a form element and submit the form directly. But these right here are going to be buttons or have the ability to do what's called a click event. So I can actually click these things. So let's exit out of the interactive shell. I'm going to run it again. This time it should navigate to Google and then actually put in the input. Now, for some reason, it didn't put the input in and it runs some sort of error. That has to do with timing, right? So it's not going to be able to find any element if it goes too fast. So you might actually have to use a way to just slow this down a little bit. This is like the fastest, most easy method to do it. And we just do time.sleep. And we say the number of seconds we want it to sleep before it actually runs the next part. This will become a lot more important when we do more advanced stuff. But now we need to find that button, that element for that button. So of course, in this case, it's just the Google search button. So I go ahead and inspect that element there. And yet again, I've got the wrong element selected by default. So I'm going to inspect it again. And what do you know? Here we go. There's my input class itself. I edit this as HTML. I copy this whole thing, paste it in here. I've got a class. That's not what I want. I've got a value. That's not what I want. I've got the ARIA label. That's not what I want. Hey, what do you know? I've got a name. That's interesting. But that's still not what I want. I actually want the submit type because that name could change. It's certainly possible. In this case, the name could change. The reason for that is because the type for submit button will override whatever the name is. The name doesn't matter nearly as much with the submit button as it does for the inputs that are actually taking in text, because the submit button just needs the event of somebody clicking on it. So let's go ahead and get rid of all of these other things. We've now found our input type of submit. Okay, so now how do I actually find this submit button? Well, it's also fairly simple. We're going to be using the element by CSS collector, or selector rather, and I'm going to call this the submit btn element, and I'm going to set this equal to my browser dot find element by CSS selector. And if you're familiar with these CSS selectors, you'll know that there's one for input. So you can use an input like this, and we can say type equals to submit. And that should actually find us our submit button. Now we could also use the same thing for name equals to Q, right? So that actually solves this up here if we were to want to do it that way as well. But I'm going to leave it in as type being submit. And I'm also going to go ahead and print out submit.get attributes, let's say, for instance, name. I just want to show you that, yeah, you can get the other attributes on here. So doing web scraping is certainly still possible with Selenium. In fact, it's probably more robust doing web scraping than anything else because we can know that all of the JavaScript is loaded before we do anything and we get all these other session related things. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run that without anything on the submit button element. I just want to make sure it's there. It's the correct one. We're getting some attribute name, and it will take a few seconds because I did time.sleep. And now I get button K. And of course, that's what it was when I actually grabbed that element, but that's nice to know that I've now found it. So what I can do is run the click event on here, on this button itself. So submit button.click. Okay. So again, I will add another sleep method here so we can see all of this happen. So I'll do sleep of 2, and we're going to exit out of the interactive shell again. I'm going to close out some of these sessions that I had open from Chrome. You might have all these open as well. And I just want my one Chrome session open. Okay, so now that I've got this, let's go ahead and run it. This should open the web browser for me. It does. It will wait a second before it enters text. It does, and then it waits a couple seconds before it submits it, and it does. Look at that. How cool is that? I think that's pretty sweet. Okay, so we now have some of the fundamentals down for this. Now, what we just did inside of this Google one is not any different than doing password entry, right? So all we did was text, just a query, but we did it based off of the name. So in theory, we could use this exact same method to open up a place where we need to log into and keep that session open as well. Now we're going to go ahead and log in to a service. Now, whenever it comes to using passwords or keys, you want to be as secretive about them as possible. So the very first thing I want to show you is a pretty awesome built-in way that Python has to make it as secure as possible. So inside of a day 16, I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call this insta.py because we will be eventually logging into Instagram. But I wanted to introduce you to the getPass library. So you're going to want to import getPass, and I'll say my password equals to getPass.getPass, and I'll say what is your password. Okay, so let's see what this looks like. I'm going to toggle the terminal with Control tilde, and I'm going to go ahead and run Python insta.py. Right off the bat, it asks you what's your password, and I can say ABC. It doesn't seem like anything happened. So let's go ahead and just add a new line here, and then I'll go ahead and print out my password. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run that again, and I'll say ABC. I did type it, I hit enter, and it actually responds with the actual password itself. Okay, so this is actually showing me how I recommend that you store your password going forward. Now, the reason I'm going to be using a conf.py file has to do with the fact that I don't want to have to re-enter it every single time I'm showing you something. I just want it to be there and usable. Now, do keep in mind that if you end up using a conf.py file, you're probably going to want to get in the habit of changing whatever that password is after you run anything that we're related to doing. Because I certainly do not want you losing your passwords because of doing something silly like leaving it in a conf.py file like I have right here. So let's go ahead and get started actually doing this whole process. I'm going to leave this in here as reference for you, but I'm certainly not going to be using that method right now. So let's go ahead and do from conf. We're going to import the Insta username and the Insta password. And then I'll go ahead and do from Selenium. I'm going to go ahead and import the web driver, just like we did with Google. And I'll go ahead and say browser equals to webdriver.chrome. And then I want to go ahead and say the URL is going to be https://www.instagram.com. And we'll just do browser.get this URL. Okay, I'm going to close down this Explorer a little bit so I have more room to work. And now I'm going to go ahead and use the interactive shell to get in here, mainly because I want access to Selenium and that Selenium session while I go forward. So python-i insta.py. And naturally, Instagram.com opens up. So much like in Google, when we did that one, we had to look for the input with some sort of name, right? So we did it by find element by name. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm also going to make sure that time is imported. So I'll import time and then do time.sleep. I'll give it 2 seconds. And then I want to find the element by name. So in this case, it's going to be the username element, and it's going to be find element by name. I'm going to just take a stab in the dark and say username. And then I'll go ahead and do the same thing with password. Now, the reason I'm taking a stab in the dark has to do with how so many services name their login elements. So let's actually take a look at what we've got on Instagram. And I'll go ahead and inspect the element here. And I might have to do this a couple times to get the right one. And then if I zoom in the console, I'll probably see exactly what I was looking for. And we've got our input here. And what do you know? The name is username. And then the password, let's go ahead and check that out. Password, name is password, as I suspected. And then we need the login button. So I'll go ahead and do the inspect element here. So the actual submit button is what I'm looking for here, and it's button type the button class with the type of submit. So this one's actually pretty easy as well. If you don't remember, it's simple. We would call this the submit btn element equals to browser.find element by CSS selector. This is one way to do it. And then it's going to be the button and the type equaling to submit. Okay, so I'm going to close down this Explorer here. So now that I've got these things, I can just go ahead and run them on my interactive shell here. Okay, so I've got those elements. Now, of course, we remember we have to do something like the element and then send keys. And then in my case, I need to send my Insta username. And then I need to send my Insta password. So password. And send keys, password. Okay, and then the submit button. Real simple, we just call btn.click. Okay, so again, I'll go ahead and send my username with those keys. And this is one of the reasons you should love the interactive shell. Send the password with those keys. And if we look in our session, username and password were filled out. And then I'm going to go ahead and do time.sleep. And I'll do 3 seconds. Oh, I didn't import time. So import time. Time.sleep 3 seconds. And then I want to submit that. And there it goes. Okay, so I don't necessarily need to have a sleep call here, but I will do it, time.sleep. And this time I'll just do 1.5 seconds. Just to make sure my username and password were entered, and entered in a somewhat reasonable manner. But what do you know? There you go. We just logged in to a service. Now, that is super simple, right? Like, we just find the elements, username and password, and now we're inside of whatever element we want to use, right? So this is where we can do all sorts of things. Now, before I get into the Instagram specific things, let's just go ahead and get the HTML text, and I'll just do browser, and we want to get or find element by CSS selector, for example, and we can just use body. And then this is going to be actually the body element. That'd be body element. And then the HTML text would be body element dot get attribute inner HTML. And it's lowercase like that with the capital HTML. Otherwise, you will find that you have an error there. And then I'll go ahead and print this out. And I'll copy and paste this. And there you go. You've got all of the HTML element that you would need to parse. So as far as web scraping goes, going back to what we've done before, which was requests HTML, we can now use that to parse that HTML content right here, which is another reason why I actually showed you requests HTML in the way that I did, if you did that with us. But it was essentially you just feed in HTML to request.html, and then you can actually grab the HTML content in there. You can grab stuff like the links, the absolute links, and so on. So that's certainly something that I am interested in doing, just not quite yet. I don't think what we're at yet is that great. So let's do the next part of this, which is actually clicking the follow button for us. I like to do it automatically. If all we wanted to do was web scraping behind this login, all we had to do was grab the HTML document, any HTML document, and then parse it with something like Python requests HTML. But what we want to do is actually add automated interaction with the service. In this case, it's Instagram. But for example, I want to actually click this follow button, or I want to run a search. These things start to get a lot more complicated because of how any given web application is designed, right? So we have the very basic and very common way of logging in, right? So this is unbelievably common across services, but the follow button is not necessarily common, right? A lot of places use follow, some places do not, right? So like your bank doesn't have a follow button, most likely. So if we want to actually click this follow button, that's where what we're about to do is really important. But again, if we just wanted to parse the HTML, this is how you grab the HTML for any sort of CSS selector, and then you've got that HTML there, and you can go ahead and do the scraping that you want. We will give some more examples of that shortly. So let's go ahead and actually grab the element that I want to interact with. So in this case, it's that follow button. So if I inspect the element here, of course, you want to make sure that you're using a user that you don't already follow. Otherwise, you'll see it looking a little bit more like this, where you can message them. So you want to make sure that that follow button is there. Otherwise, this is not going to work for you. And do keep in mind that Instagram does throttle accounts. So if you start following a ton of people, it's definitely going to throttle your ability to do so. So anyways, I'm in here now. I've got this button highlighted. I'm going to go ahead and edit it as HTML. I'll copy this element here, and we'll bring it into VS Code and paste it in as this documentation. Okay, so what I see here is nothing that I think identifies this super uniquely in the attributes. Right? These classes don't make a whole lot of sense to me. Maybe the developers that created this, it makes a lot of sense to them, and they are unique to this particular element, but I'm not going to trust that. What I would rather do is just say button and follow. Like, I want those two elements themselves. Now, if you remember back up here, I can use the CSS selector to grab any or all buttons. And if I did find elements by CSS selector, this would give me all elements that are a button, and I can literally click all of those until I actually click the follow button. I could also iterate through there to find what the text says to say if it's equal to that follow button. That is one way to do it, but instead I wanted to show you a little bit more advanced, and that's called using XPath. So XPath is similar to a CSS selector in the sense that it can grab things, but I can also add some additional attributes to it that CSS selectors don't do as far as I know. So what I mean by that is I can select something. Let's go ahead and just say my button XPath equals to // that's a common thing, and then button. Okay, and then to make an identical call to the CSS selector, we just pass in, instead of by CSS selector, we do it by XPath, and we pass in this argument here. Right, so it's literally that string. So that's not that big of a deal here. Okay, so it's going to find the same ones as this. But if I wanted to make it more advanced, like I want my follow btn XPath, In this case, I can actually add in some brackets here, these square brackets, and type out contains parentheses. Inside of contains, I use text parentheses and follow. I'm going to go ahead and use actual single quotes here. Okay, so now this will give me all of the buttons that contain the word follow. Now, I do actually want to have one more aspect to this and put other brackets here. And I'll say not contains the text follow, or single quotes again, following. Okay, so this is two strings here, or two conditions, if you will. One saying that, hey, it needs to include the text follow. The next one is saying that it does not include the text following. That is certainly a button on Instagram through what I've done. So we don't want to actually click on the following button, but rather just follow. So now I've got my follow button here, and I should be able to grab that. And this is going to be follow BTN's or follow button elements. We'll actually write out elements. And again, the reason it's elements is because I have this S here. If I took that S away, it would just look for one single instance of that follow button, which is not what we want. So what I can do then is I can iterate through all of these. So for BTN in follow button elements, I can do time.sleep. This is critical, right? I don't want to overload the system. This is kind of like self-throttling, so we don't just jam their system up and get flagged. That's what we definitely don't want to have happen. Which in my case, my account is already like throttled itself. So, you know, my following may or may not work. So we do btn.click, and then we say accept pass. So this is going to attempt it on all of those follow buttons, and it's really just that simple. Okay, so that's actually a method to grab these follow buttons. We'll test this in just a second, but obviously what I want to do is, well, I don't need to use this example. By all means, go ahead and try it out on your own. But what I actually want to do is change it away from button and just having any element that contains this follow and not following, and then I'm just going to click that element. So in some cases, maybe it is a anchor tag or an A tag. So I want to have both of those things actually work. So I'm just going to go ahead and do all elements with that star there, and it's going to contain everything. So I'll just go ahead and leave those as reference as well, just for things that you could try out if you need. So A tag, button, and then finally all. Okay, so I'm going to define this as click to follow, or follow button, you know, whatever you want to call this function. I'm going to pass this forward here. And what I want to pass in is literally just the browser or the client session itself. So browser, and then that way I can actually trigger the current session, whatever it is, to use this click to follow method itself. So by all means, you can now use this exact same one on your Instagram. It might also work on other services too. So with that in mind, let's actually go ahead and open up a session here. So we'll do python-i instead of pi. And of course, this is going to open up a browser, log us in. I'm not touching anything. I don't want to touch anything. I just want it to run. If you move things around or click an element, it might actually interrupt your service a little bit. Okay, so I'm on Instagram. Now what I want to do is actually navigate to that new user, right? So I'll say new user equals to, and of course, in my case, I'm just going to grab that URL that I had, which is just simply instagram.com/TED. And of course, if you've never seen TED Talks, I highly recommend it. Next, I'm going to go ahead and do browser.get, and let's call this the new user URL. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and copy and paste these into my interactive shell. And of course, if I break down VS Code, I should see this actually happen in real time. Okay, so here's my session going, and VS Code is right here. So I'll go ahead and run that. And it brought me there. No big surprise. And then the next thing I want to do is actually trigger my follow button. So I will just copy it first before I actually run it. I'll copy this, paste it here. Before I press enter, I'll collapse this down so we can see it in action. I hit enter, and going through all of them, and sure enough, it clicked it. Cool. So this time it also grabbed followers. It actually clicked on a button for followers, and notice that I have following in there. So I might need to add or append to my element here, or my XPath lookup, by adding one of these blocks here, and take off followers. All right, so again, we used every element here. So I don't want followers, I just want follow. Okay. So now that I've got that, I'm going to go ahead and copy that same function and bring it into my current session. So let's recopy this function. Copy and paste. And then we're going to run it one more time. Now, typically speaking, I'm probably not going to do it this way. Typically speaking, I would probably just follow a certain list of users and then go off of that, right? But what we should see is I'm actually going to bring this button down here in the session. I should be able to actually follow all of those users down there as well. Not that I particularly want to follow them, but I just want to illustrate the purpose here, or the point of having something like this. This is automating that interaction. So yet again, it actually called up the followers themselves, which of course is not what I wanted. So the chaining of these might actually not work as I anticipated. So let's get rid of that for a moment, and I'll just leave it back in as button just for a second. This is what those trial and error things do from time to time. Okay, so let's go ahead and try it just with that button. Again, I want to make sure that this is opened, and click to follow again. And there we go. So now it's actually going off of just the button. So through your testing, that is something that's very likely to happen, which is part of the reason why I'm like, hey, I want to show you how to do all, or I want to show you how to do the button, and it's worth testing those things out. And apparently with XPath, you can't actually chain too many of these things together. There's probably a way to add another condition in here, but I don't actually need to use XPath that often, because more than likely, I'm actually not continuously trying to follow all sorts of accounts. So notice that it stopped. Now, the reason for that is because of how these buttons were dynamically loaded. So if I run it again, it's going to now follow all of these new accounts. And it does it in a speed that makes absolute sense for this particular user, or like a real human, right? But again, I'm totally automating this. I'm not doing anything on here. So if I actually go into my Instagram account on a different browser session, I can see that my following count, or who I'm following, should be going up. Now it also depends on assuming that my click to follow is still running. So let's go ahead and run that again. And now it's going to increment by 1 every second or so. And I already have some followers, which is hilarious, because this is just a blank account. So people are following me back, even though I, don't have a real account. So anyways, that's actually how to create the follow button itself, and actually clicking on that follow button and doing it in an automated fashion. Now, if you were to get a little bit more advanced, or want to get a little bit more advanced, a couple challenges I have for you are to try and see all of the suggested ones, or to keep running this until you follow pretty much everything it suggests. How do you actually go about doing that? I don't actually think it's that hard to do. It's called a recursive function. I'll give you that hint. But actually following all these users is not actually what I want. Instead, what I want to do now is actually go to any given user and scrape some of their data, or actually interact with any given post too. Now we're going to go ahead and use XPath to find individual posts for a user. In this case, the user I'm going to be using is The Rock. So let's go ahead and grab that URL. And this time I'll say The Rock URL. And obviously I want to navigate to there. And let's make sure I do it after some time. So time.sleep, 2 seconds. And so what I want to do is open up this Rocks page and then find any given link in here. So let's go ahead and start the process by starting the interactive shell. Of course, saving instead of .py. Okay. So again, I don't want to actually interact with that browser that comes up. I clicked off of it. If you interact with it, you might run into some issues. Just always keep that in mind. Okay, so now we go into here, and I want to inspect the element on any given item here. So I'm going to go ahead and go inspect here, and I have to do it again. So I'm looking for the actual link itself. Okay, and if I zoom in here, we can see that the link, or the A tag, has an href, and here's the link to that actual post. Right, so if you command click or control click, you can actually open up that post itself, and that gives you what it is that we are looking for. So that's actually the format of the link. And I know that all posts essentially start with this /p there. And I know this only because I've used Instagram enough to actually recognize that pattern. So literally, if I use this post URL pattern, I know that pretty much every single post has something like this, or right, like post slug ID, right? And obviously replacing this with any given post. So I know that this is the pattern I want to look for, is instagram.com/p. So what that means then is my post XPath string is going to be something like the A tag, right? So we said it was an A tag. Looking back in here, we see that it's an A tag. Okay. Of course, if I actually wanted to scrape all links, I could totally use this, and it probably would give me a vast majority of the posts. But I want to get a little bit more specific. So I actually want to use contains again. So using those brackets, put in here contains. So this time, instead of using text, we would use the @href and then /p/. Okay. So what I know here, let's close it off with a parentheses there. So what I know here with any given pattern, I know that for sure /p is in there. I'm not positive if Instagram.com is going to be in there, right? As we could verify by even looking here, Instagram.com is not in there. The link itself, or the href attribute, only has the path to whatever that URL is. So now we have a way to parse, in theory, all of the posts on any given page. So that means then I can say post links equals to browser.find elements by XPath, and that string. And again, it's going to be elements, not element. Okay, so that's going to be all of those links. So I can say well, let's go ahead and just grab the first iteration of it. So I'll go ahead and say post link equals to the post links 0. And let's just be a little bit better as far as our Python code is concerned. And we'll just say if the length of the post links is greater than 0, then we'll have that actual post length, or a post link itself. Post link is not equal to none. Then we're going to go to browser.get that post link. Okay, real simple. We're going to go to the Rocks page and then do all these things. Now, I'm already at the Rocks page, so I'm already at line 57 here. So I can actually just copy and paste these other lines. I'm going to go ahead and copy this, paste it in there, get an invalid syntax error here. Just make sure that these are correct. So I'll just copy this. And then we will grab that one. And we're getting none type for our post links. Okay. So it looks like we have nothing as far as our A tags are concerned. So we are going to have to probably, there we go. Haha, there's the problem. They should say post link And we try that again. Okay, it looks like I should be able to navigate to that link. So I hit enter. And one more time. And I'm getting an invalid URL must be a string. Yes, of course, because this right here is the element. So this should be the post link element, not the post link. That was a silly mistake. Okay, because again, right here is going to give me all of the elements. This will give me a single element. So all I need to do here to actually grab the post link, or rather the post href, we grab that element and then we do get attribute href, and then we can actually go to that link right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and try all of those again. And that time it actually changed the browser. I don't know if you saw it refresh, but there it goes. It actually changed the browser out, and now I can actually work with whatever this link is. So that's cool. So the next part of this is actually grabbing the data that's in there, right? So again, I'm still in that browser session, so I can grab whatever the HTML data is. Now in this case, I just want the area where the image, or where the content actually is, not the comments, but the content. So I can go ahead and inspect the element here, and I'm just looking for the main area for this div class, right? And I'm just going to keep going down, and it's a little bit tricky to actually figure out which one's which, what we actually need. But what's not tricky is the element of video and image, right? So video and image, those are very standard. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to copy these files themselves from the source that they are. Okay. So what that means then is we'll say videos, or video, how about we call it video elements, or video Ls, is browser dot find element. We could still use XPath, and I'll just do video. And I'll use that same idea for images. And this one's just img. That's the image tag for any given image. Okay. So now that I have these two things, let's take a look. I'm going to grab this, paste this in here. And video elements, I have at least a single video element. And image elements, take a look at that. Looks like I might have some of those as well. And I probably need to actually use S's here. That way I get all of those elements. And there we go. It's giving me more than one this time, which was what I actually inspected. So image elements, this is going to give me a lot more. Now, no surprise here, the reason being has to do with all of these other images and any other image that's on the page, right? So it's actually going to literally get all of those images, which of course makes this a little bit more tricky as to what we're trying to accomplish here and how we can find where that actual location is, right? So right now it's just not that clear. So that's okay. I mean, it's really up to you on how you want to go about finding or parsing what data is important to you. But what we can do is say for img in image elements, I can print out the img.get attribute and src. So this is going to give me all of the URLs to those actual images, assuming that they have them. And we could save these. Okay. So I'm actually not sure if we have requests installed. We do not. I could use Selenium for this part, but I'm going to use Python requests. So I'm going to exit out of that session, pip env install requests. You might also want to install request.html, but the idea here is we're going to actually download and save these items here. And I'll go ahead and put in, let's start that session again. This is going to open up a new session. I close out the old one, let that one run, and inside of insta. Hi, I'm going to import requests. I'm also going to import this and add it into my session here. And again, I notice I have all these images here. So if I scroll down to the elements, what I want to do is I want to grab the base name. So one other thing I need to import, close down this here. I'm also going to import OS. Okay, so I'll just make an image directory here. So img dir equals to os path dot dir name of file. So let's actually call this base dir, or rather os path dot absolute path of that file. And then image dir equals to os path dot join base dir and images and os dot make dirs of that image directory. And we'll go ahead and say exist. Okay, true. Okay, so now I have an image directory in here. So what I can do then is say, well, I want to grab the file name with doing os path dot base name of the source file. So the actual URL is equal to this here. So the base name will give me, in theory, the base name or one of the base names for that. It might not work perfectly, but that's okay. And then I'll go ahead and say, I want to grab the request. So r equals to requests.get, that URL. Actually, I'm going to make it stay open. So let's try this a little bit different. And I'll say with requests.get URL. And we'll say stream equals to true. And we'll set it as R. And then make sure you indent here. And then we'll do try r.raise for status. And exception, we'll just say continue, which means we go to the next loop. Like it will break the current loop and then just skip to the next iteration. And then what I want to do here then is say for chunk in r.iter content, I want to actually write to a file. So file.write the chunk. And this is because there's the ability to actually write out videos, right? So we can actually download videos. So before this, of course, I actually want to have a file itself. So I did f.write. So I'll go ahead and say with open, and I want to have my file name and my image directory. So I'll go ahead and say file path equals to os path.join. This is going to be my image dir or video directory, and then the file name. So opening up this file path, and we're going to do it as write bytes as f. So wb is write bytes versus read bytes, or just w, which would not write the bytes. So rb write bytes. This will override what's also already in there as well. So what this should do is actually save all of those images. Now I did a bunch of things, so I'm not going to copy and paste this session. Instead, what I'm going to do is close it out and exit out of that session, close out that terminal, and let's try and run this again. I'm going to open up my Explorer here, because what should happen is it should make a new directory for me once it gets down here, and then it should actually add in all of the images that it finds in that post. So there's that. And right, so like right now, a lot of these are not actually named correctly, right? So they're not named correctly because of the question mark that comes after it. But here's one that is a PNG file. So we actually have an issue with these images. So let's go ahead and delete this. Move those to trash. And it has to do with the file name that we created, which was this right here. So what I want to do is actually get the base file name and get rid of all of those other like parameters to them as far as the file name is concerned, not the URL, because we definitely want to still get the exact same URL. But if we look at, here's one example of a URL. Notice that the .jpeg is right here. And then it had all of this other stuff. So I just want to grab and get rid of all of that other stuff. So we're going to go ahead and parse out these query parameters. So this URL has a bunch of extra data on here, probably to actually render out that image correctly. Now I want to parse it just for the file name. I don't want to parse it for everything else. So it's really simple. We're just going to use a built-in Python package. So I'm going to go to the very top here, and we're going to import urllib.parse. We're going to import the URL parse, or sorry, not import, but from urllib.parse. We're going to import URL parse. And so what I want is down into my image loop here. I've got this file name, but I want to go ahead and just say base URL equals to URL parse URL, and then .path. So this should give me just the base URL path. So I'm going to go ahead and use that base URL path here and just grab the base name, which we'll see in just a moment, but I'll go ahead and print out what that base URL looks like. And of course, if there is no URL, then we're probably going to run into some issues here. But let's go ahead and do this. I'm not going to start a new session. Instead, I'm just going to go ahead and do that import and then run that loop again, which I should still have active, right? I should still be able to run this even though I just ran that session. So I'm getting no such directory or file. So I did delete them, so maybe I need to just rerun the make directories here. Okay, so let's rerun this loop and hit enter. Okay, so it's definitely creating things. Let's just take a look here in my images. So now I should actually be able to render out these images, but notice the file names are much more accurate to a real JPEG image. And if I click on any of them, I actually get images here. And they look like a lot of the users. They don't actually look like the post itself. And that's because the post I'm looking at is actually not related to a post, but rather a video. So I'm going to do the same thing with videos. So let's go ahead and copy this. But this time, instead of actually iterating through this way, I'm going to turn it into a function called scrape and save. And I'll go ahead and say elements and tab that in a little bit. So this is going to be iterating through the elements. Let's close things out a little so we don't have to see it. So this is going to be L in elements. I'm going to get the attribute of src. So going into our session, let's make sure a video has that attribute. Okay, so looking for that video, we just need to kind of tab through here with all the various HTML content that we've got. There, I found the video. Let's open that up a little bit. And the video, of course, does have an src. So this should work on images and videos. And you can check out that base URL in there as well. Okay, so scrape and save is our new function here. So scrape and save, I'm going to do the video elements. The base directory I still kept as the image directory. That's no big deal. I could call it, let's call it data instead. So data dir. Okay. And I'm also going to say if os path.exists, then we're going to go ahead and hit continue, which would just take me to the next iteration. In other words, I don't want to resave the same stuff over and over again. Okay, so now I should be able to go through the video elements and also the image elements. All right, so let's close out our session again and exit out on our Python terminal as well. Run the interactive shell and let that go. I probably should have deleted that image directory, but it's going to make a new directory, so I'll delete the image one in just a moment. But here's the automations going, changes to that page. It runs through the iterations, it should actually find all the images, find all the videos, and store all of that for us. There's a video actually loading. It's going to take some time because a video might be actually kind of big, and depending on your internet connection, that does absolutely make a pretty large difference. So I'm going to go ahead and reveal this in the Finder. And there's the post. And what do you know? There's the actual post with the video as well. Right, so it's the actual video and audio that's coming in there. And it seems to be taking a good amount of time to actually go through what it needs to go through. Okay, so it finished, and mine says image L's. It should be images L's. I made that mistake. No big deal. The videos did download. We can verify that. The images will be a lot faster than the videos. But as I iterate through these or just loop through them, I can see, hey, check it out, a thumbnail, or actually that's the video itself. There's another image. There's another image. There's a number of images in here, right? So the videos, the images, they're all downloading, and that's how you actually go about scraping it. So the key thing to take away here is this portion is how you actually download pretty large content. So this actually works for even really large files, and you can change the chunk size or like how big it's going to be, which can speed up your download process. So this is a pretty common one. I think that's actually the default size, but you can check requests for that. But this goes through each chunk of the file, and then it'll save it to your local file. Of course, if that's interrupted, then you don't get the whole file. But this is a more efficient, memory efficient way to actually download and save these files. And then, of course, actually getting rid of those URL parameters was really nice, because then we could actually parse out that file name. Now, in some cases, there is no file name. Like, it doesn't actually even tell you what the file name is, right? So in our case, we were lucky that it had a JPEG or an MP4 in it. But in other services, they don't have either one. So you're going to have to do some more clever things to actually find out what either the file extension is or the file name is. If it's images, you can probably assume that it's a JPEG image. Those compress really well. But if you need to, you could use the Python image library or PIL to try and open the final result. So after you save it, you could try and open that in PIL or Pillow. And if it opens, then great, it's an image. If it doesn't open, then you can just ignore whatever that is. So that's pretty cool. And also using PIL, you can verify if it's a certain size. So let's say, for instance, I want to ignore all of these smaller images, right? So in this case, that's definitely a user's photo, but the dimensions are 150 by 150. So we can use the Python image library to verify, let's type that right, the size of any given image. That's going to be a nice little challenge for you. It's not really that hard to do, but it is something that I will challenge you to do on how you can actually do this in the request itself or shortly after the request. So you could download it, look it up, and then delete it. Or even better than completely deleting it is just keeping basically an empty version of that file. In other words, just writing the file, but not actually storing any data to it, depending on that actual size, because then you can skip it in the future. In other words, if I actually ran this again, it should not re-scrape everything, right? Because all of those files already exist. So that's another key thing of why I did it that way, is to make sure that, hey, I can download all these images and that's cool, but I don't want to re-scrape them over and over again. One last thing that I would consider doing to make this a better scraper is to actually add the user who this sort of belongs to, right? So this file path, adding maybe the usernames here and creating all the directories necessary to make sure that I'm getting any given image for that particular user. There's going to be a lot of things in there that aren't actually posts for that user, but that's something you could definitely spend a lot more time on doing as well. So that's pretty cool. Now, that's, of course, just the scraping portion of this. I do want to actually be able to like or maybe even comment on this as well. That goes back to being Selenium and getting some more advanced usage of how we go through with Selenium. So now that we know how to scrape and save any given image or video, it's time to actually go ahead and interact with what's going on there. Now, the reason for this is something that I think would be really cool to be able to do is use machine learning to, let's say, categorize the post or classify the post. Let's say classify, because that's what you would call it. Classify the post's image or video, and then comment in a relevant fashion. Right? So that's the long-term goal. We're not going to do that in this series because that's just starts to get really a lot more complicated than I want to make 30 Days of Python to be. But that would be really cool. And the reason I'm also showing you how to do all this stuff has to do with exactly that. It's amazing how easy it is to create a service that can essentially download that data, analyze it, and then comment back on that, all automated, right? So using machine learning would be able to classify maybe not every image super well, but a lot of them. And especially if it's like a specific person or a specific group of people that post very common things, right? Like I know The Rock comments or posts all the time in the gym, working out. You know, you could classify that, hey, he's working out. And then your automated comment could be some variation of like, nice workout, or hey, way to go, or make sure you buy my protein supplement, or something like that, something ridiculous like that. And again, this is for understanding that these systems are set up this way. Like they're not set up to prevent this from happening, like which is interesting, right? So we are, even as beginners, we are able to come in here and do a lot of these things. All right, so let's go ahead and start this session all over again. Now, I actually am not going to run the scrape and save again or the click to follow, right? I'm just going to go ahead and go back to the Rock and take a look at that. So let's go ahead and restart our session. I'm going to exit out of here and go into Insta. So hopefully this takes me to the most recent post, whatever that might be. That's this portion right here. So that should give me the Rock's most recent post as an individual detail. And there it is. Okay. So first things first, let's go ahead and actually make a comment. I'm going to inspect the element for the comment button itself. I might need to open up the browser here a little bit. And sorry if this is going to be a little small. I just want to make sure I can grab that specific element. So I'll zoom in so we can see what this is. So let's get rid of part of it. Like I don't want to zoom in too much on the browser, otherwise we might lose it. Okay, there we go. So yet again, we don't have anything related to the actual name of this text area. This text area does not have a name, but it does have a placeholder. So let's go ahead and edit this element here. I'm going to copy this, bring this into VS Code, and we'll scroll to the bottom. And now let's take a look at this element. Right. So Instagram does this on purpose. They do not want you to be able to submit things automatically, although it definitely still can be done. Okay, so what I want to get is I want to grab the element. So let's call this the comment L, and it's going to be browser.findElement by XPath. This case is going to be one single element. I believe there's only one element, which we can test out in just a moment. And I want to use the text area. So let's go ahead and say my comment XPath string. Remember, it starts with the 2 slashes. And it's going to be a text area. Okay. So the text area, we want to use brackets and contains. Now, again, I'm going to use an A tag. For attribute, this is going to be placeholder. And this is going to be add a comment. Okay. So I am not positive if this is going to work. Let's go ahead and try this out. And in theory, I would grab that element and then I would send keys and say Awesome. Something like that. Okay. So let's go ahead and paste that in there. Make sure that that's correct. Let's just verify. Parentheses are closed at placeholder. And there we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and find that element. Let's see if it's even there. It appears that it is. So let's go ahead and send these keys. I'm not going to press enter yet, just because I want to see to make sure. I'm going to press enter now. Boom. That's awesome. Okay, like literally. I can actually post it now. So, but what I need to do is actually find the next element, which would be the button that's right next to it with submit. But I'm actually going to go, a little nuts here. And I'm just going to say submit btns equals to. I'm going to just try out grabbing all buttons that have the type equaling to submit. Or rather, button with the type equaling to submit. Okay. And we can actually use the CSS selector for this. We don't have to do it with the XPath. Let's just keep on that. So now I'll go ahead and do submit btns equals to browser dot find elements by CSS selector. Submit buttons. Okay, so for btn in submit buttons, we're going to go ahead and try btn.click accept pass. Okay, so submit buttons. Let's go ahead and look at this. Oh, I renamed this incorrectly or named this incorrectly. This should be XPath. That way nothing gets confused here. And then this will be submit button elements or Ls. Go. Okay, let's try that again. Let's just take a look, make sure there's something in there. Looks like there is. There's only one. That's a good sign. Shocking that there's only one, but there's only one. So I'm going to go ahead and run it. And I'm going to copy and paste. And in theory, this will actually post for me. I'll copy and paste it. Enter a couple times. And look at that loading. Look at that. That is an automated comment. All right, so before I go into this next part, let's go ahead and put the automated comments into a method itself called automate comment. And we'll just pass in the content here. In this case, I will say that's like something like that. That is cool. You know, super generic. Of course, if you want to get a little bit more advanced, you could have a list of things and sending from that list. It could be a really long list of actual content items you'd pass through there. Or, of course, using machine learning to initially classify what's in the content and then make that comment. Of course, I want to add this into send keys. And then I want to make sure that I'm also separating these things out well enough. So I'll do time.sleep. And then I'll do, let's say, like 3 seconds initially. And then before I actually submit it, I will also do, let's say, 2 seconds. So let's go ahead and try this out now. And I'll put this at the very bottom. Actually, let's just leave it out. And I'll run the interactive shell. I'm just going to go ahead and let it run. And once it's done, I'll come back. Cool. So now at that post, let's go ahead and try out this automate comment thing here and run that. And I get element is not interactable. So I'm getting something with each element. So without actually going into the browser at all, let's go ahead and try this out again. So it was working. So it's possible that we need to, oops, there's a little problem there. Let's try that. There we go. Possible we might have to adjust this slightly. Okay, and just doing line by line just to verify that this is definitely working. And that time it worked. Okay, so what I'm going to say is I will just go ahead and pass the browser through as well, so that when I automate this comment, it should actually go through based off of that current browser session, like I talked about before. This time I'm going to go ahead and delete. That is so cool. And let's try that again. Cool, there it is. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's go ahead and move on to automating likes. So now what we're going to do is just trigger a like event, as in liking this post. Now, this is cool and all, but actually the main thing about this is actually getting the parent element. So if we inspect the element for the heart itself, what we will find is that the heart is not a button, but rather it's an SVG. So you can't actually click on an SVG. That doesn't do anything. That won't actually run the event like it would if it was the button. And again, no real identifying things for that button. The thing that's identified is the ARIA label, right? So the ARIA label of like, that is an identifiable thing. And I also could go off of height, because if we inspect the element on these other ones, I get a different height, although the same actual like itself, or the same ARIA label itself. So let's go ahead and try this out into VS Code now. I already have my browser session going, so make sure that you get yours going if you don't already. So what I want to do is say the like heart SVG XPath equals to, and this is going to be / anything that contains, and this is going to be at ARIA -label. Remember that at sign is for any attribute that's in there. And then in this case, it's going to be like, and it's a capital L, and we can close that out. Okay, so I should get every single one of these, right? So let's call this all like hearts elements, and this is going to be browser dot find elements by XPath, passing in this XPath here. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and iterate through these. So I'll go ahead and say for heart element in all heart elements, all like heart elements, I'm going to go ahead and print out the heart element dot get attribute and height. Okay, so we'll save that, and I'm going to bring this into my interactive shell here. We got invalid syntax. Oops, I didn't mean to put a colon there, but I did. Let's try that again. And now let's iterate through them. And a lot of them are 12s, and then there's one that's 24. Okay, so we want the one that's 24. If, let's call this h equals to that, h as in height, of course. So if h equals to 24, then we want to get that parent button. Well, that's going to be taking the actual heart element itself, not the browser, but the heart element itself, or any element for that matter, and then do dot find element by XPath, and then we just do dot dot. So this takes me up one level. That should be my parent button, and I can try to click it. And I can do accept path or pass. Okay. I also want to print out what that is, just in case. Now I'm going to go ahead and run this. And before I press enter, I'll collapse this down a little bit so I can see if that heart turns red. We hit enter a couple times, and it doesn't look like we got what we were looking for. I know why. It has to do with this. So we'll say if it's equal to 24 or h is equal to the string of 24. Gotta love those strings. Okay, yet again, I'm going to copy and paste it. And let's go ahead and just break this down again. we go. Okay. And hit enter a couple times. Boom. Liked it. So naturally, there's a little bit of a flaw to this right here. And that is, what if they change the height just a little bit? Then perhaps we have broken this like button. So what I'm going to assume then is that that heart will always be bigger than the other hearts. So let's go back into Chrome. In other words, this one will always be bigger than these. But as it stands right now, if we inspect this element, this is actually now an unlike label, right? So in order for me to test this theory, I got to unlike it to make sure that it's unliked. And now what I want to do is actually iterate through all the hearts, find what the biggest number is, and then iterate through them again and go off of that number instead of the one that I manually entered. Okay, so in other words, I'm just going to run this twice and grab this here. So we'll say max heart h equals to -1, because of course it's going to be bigger than -1. And I'll call this the current h. So current h equals to the int of whatever that h is. And if current h is greater than max heart h, then we'll set the max heart h or height equal to that one. So now we would just come down here then and change it to being like that. Okay, so in theory then, this should actually give me 24, assuming that that like button's actually even there. Okay, so let's go ahead and run these again. So yet again, I made sure that I unliked this. Let's go ahead and open this up. I'm just going to run it and not look at it. I printed out max heart h is 24, and there you go, it's 24. Cool. So that will definitely make sure that I'm liking that big heart button. You can certainly like all the other comments, but once you start doing stuff like that, it really starts to feel very bot-like. Every once in a while, maybe you like some of the other ones, but the real purpose of this was to see how to actually grab the parent element. And you can grab that parent's parent, right? So like the grandparent element, if you will, by doing the same method. So find element by XPath can also be used on other items, right? So you can use it on the CSS selector as well, because any element that is selected using find elements, whatever, you can actually use find elements again as a submodule basically to the other one. Okay, so in general with this like, I still want to, create another function and say automate likes and pass in the browser and tab these over. Now you might be wondering, why did I actually grab these like elements twice? Well, the reason I grabbed them twice is so I could iterate through them. And in some cases, when you iterate through it, it actually goes quote unquote stale. So it won't allow you to reiterate through it. So I just do it twice. That's it. I don't actually need the XPath twice though. I can use the same one. And then this one, I can just say the large elements, or this one being the large elements, kind of up to you. But whatever you end up using, just make sure you update that iteration. And again, the click event, I'm just going to put it next to that and just do time.sleep and 2 seconds. All right, again, we want to be as human as possible. Cool. Hey there, thanks for watching day 16. I realized that we covered a lot here, and at times it was probably rather frustrating. And that's because Selenium is not as straightforward as many other Python packages, because it's not just for Python. And Selenium itself doesn't account for what other users or other developers have done with their applications. What we saw was, well, not so straightforward ways to actually interact with one specific web application and behind their login screen. That, of course, is not going to work perfectly on another service, even if they have a lot of those same features, which, of course, that's a little frustrating. But the idea here is that there's a lot of services out there that you can start to automate these processes with. And something like Instagram, it's a little nerve-wracking that we can do something so effectively within a couple hours, and we could do it across a number of users and on a regular basis. it's kind of weird that that's even a possibility. Now, of course, there's other things that you might want to learn more about with Selenium, which is like uploading an image, like actually clicking on something to actually upload an image to Instagram. That starts to get a lot more complicated than what I wanted to cover here, and that would turn this into a full-blown Selenium course. But this is about more advanced usage of web scraping and using a web browser. So even if there's only parts of it that you can really use now, that's okay. Just realize that Selenium is a very powerful tool that you can use in the future for all sorts of web browser type automations and testing. So again, thanks so much for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.